It was the afternoon Mira walked into a credit union she had chosen specifically because neither her husband nor his solicitor had any accounts there, and she opened a single account with $6,000 in cash. That moment is where the whole mechanism begins. Everything after it was already in motion. The house in the Wyndham district smelled like cedar and radiator heat on the day I first viewed it. Not warmth in the comfort and candles sense, more like the dense warmth of a house that has been occupied for decades, that holds temperatures differently than a new build, that has learned to retain what it receives. The estate agent called it character. I called it good bones. Dorian called it a project. He meant that as a negative. He wanted something new. Glass frontage, open plan, the kind of kitchen where the appliances are indistinguishable from the cabinetry. Something that announced itself. What I saw in the house on Wyndham was a south-facing study, a double lot that backed onto a strip of original city garden, and a structure that had been built in an era when people assumed buildings needed to last. We bought it 11 years ago. I put in the full down payment from a savings account I had been building since I was 23 years old. My money, documented by a bank transfer I had printed and filed because I had always been the kind of person who filed things. Dorian had been between contracts that year. He was a commercial acquisitions consultant, which meant his income was real but irregular, coming in large amounts at unpredictable intervals, and the intervals that year had been wider than usual. He contributed his name to the joint mortgage application, which helped the approval figure, and his opinion about the kitchen island, which I discarded, and a down payment of $0. I told myself at the time that this was partnership. That contribution comes in forms other than money, that a marriage is not a ledger. Not until I was 32, and I believe this sincerely. By 39, I had learned to read ledgers. The house took a year to settle into. We repainted 2 rooms and redid the kitchen, and I spent 3 weekends building raised beds in the back garden with my own hands because Dorian was at a conference in Emberton and I had a free weekend, and the soil quality in the north corner looked promising. I planted from seed in that first spring. Tomatoes, then herbs, then in the 3rd year, a row of lavender along the eastern fence that came back every year without me doing anything more than existing nearby. I worked from the south-facing study. I'm an architectural draftsperson, not a licensed architect, because the final credentialing year had coincided with my mother's illness, and I had made the choice I've never entirely stopped reassessing. But I had enough training and enough precision that firms used my work regularly, and the south-facing windows meant I had clean, consistent daylight for drawing for 6 hours a day. The house accommodated my work in a way that felt structural, like it had been waiting for someone to need what it offered. Dorian traveled. He was good at his work when he was working, and he had a talent for the kind of networking that happens in hotels and conference rooms, the face-to-face relationship building that makes deals move. He brought back gifts sometimes, regional wines, things he'd found in airport bookshops, once an extremely impractical ceramic bowl from somewhere in the south of the country that we both pretended to like, and that sat on the mantelpiece for 4 years before I quietly moved it to a high shelf. The early years were decent years. I want to be clear about that. Not extraordinary. Not what either of us had probably imagined, in the abstract way you imagine things before you're living them. But there was structure. There was mutual maintenance. There was, for a long time, enough resemblance to a shared life that I didn't look too closely at the underlying architecture. I was good at not looking too closely. That was the skill I had to undo. I first heard Seraphine's name in December, about 3 years before everything that followed. Dorian was in the kitchen on his phone, and I was crossing through on my way back from the garden, and he said, "Seraphine's already run the projections, so we're ahead on that." A professional name, a professional context. I cataloged it without registering it. By the following February, it appeared more frequently. Still professionally framed, still anchored to the Asheville group work, but with an ease that names develop when they've been used enough to become comfortable. Seraphine thinks the Aldercroft valuation is optimistic. Seraphine flagged something in the regulatory language. I need to check with Seraphine on the timeline before I commit. I noticed the name the way I notice when a door doesn't hang quite right. Not with alarm, with attention. What I noticed more specifically was his voice when he said it. Not animated. Dorian was rarely animated. But there was a slight adjustment. A smoothing. The way a person's voice changes when they've been mentally rehearsing what they're about to say and almost succeed at sounding casual. I filed it. I want to describe this correctly because it matters. I am not a woman who performs suspicion. I don't check phones or go through pockets or run searches on names, not because I have some elevated ethical standard about privacy, but because I have always found direct evidence more useful than shadow evidence. And direct evidence arrives on its own timeline if you're willing to wait. So I waited, and I watched, and I kept the south-facing study and the lavender and the kitchen I had designed myself, and I let the pattern develop. By April, 5 months after I had first heard the name, I had what I needed, not dramatically. No confrontation in a car park, no overheard phone call with incriminating specificity, no dry cleaning receipt in a blazer pocket. What I had was an accumulation of data points that, arranged in sequence, I had composed a structure as legible as a floor plan. The Thursday dinners. For 2 years, Dorian had made Thursday evening the one consistent social occasion he maintained, a standing group with 3 of his work contacts held at rotating restaurants in the Fox Hollow district. I had never attended. It was always described as professional, not social, and I hadn't minded. Starting in February, the Thursday dinners became less regular, but the Thursday absences didn't. He would come home later, with the faintly distracted air of someone winding down from a different kind of evening. The hotel loyalty points statement. His account had been set up years before we met, and the statement arrived by post in an envelope addressed to our shared letterbox. He had not thought to redirect it. The statement covered 8 months. All 22 overnight stays. Not one coincided with a work trip I had been aware of. I took the statement to the study and sat with it. The feeling I had is difficult to translate into terms that don't misrepresent it. It wasn't shock. I had been watching the pattern develop for months, and my body already knew. What I felt was closer to something settling. The specific settling that happens when a structure has completed its shift and the foundation has found its new equilibrium. Not comfortable, but stable in a different way than before. I put the statement in a folder I labeled Tax Documents, 2019, and filed it between architectural specification sets. Then I went and made dinner. Dorian came home at 9 and said he'd been at a client dinner. I said I'd saved him a plate. We ate in the kitchen without the television. That's the way we had done every Thursday for 11 years, and I watched him tell me about his evening and thought, he has absolutely no idea. That gap, the gap between what he thought I knew and what I actually knew, was the first asset I identified. I let 3 weeks pass before I did anything with it. This was deliberate. Acting immediately would have been acting emotionally, and emotional action was exactly what Dorian would have wanted, because emotional action produces chaos, and chaos is easy to manage when you're the one who caused it and have been thinking about the consequences while the other person was still in the dark. What I needed to understand before I moved was the financial picture. And what I found when I began to look at the financial picture with the same attention I had given the pattern of his absences was that Dorian had been doing something I should have noticed earlier. He had been organizing. Not dramatically. He hadn't emptied accounts or forged signatures. He was too careful for that, and I suspect too aware of legal exposure. What he had done was quieter and more strategic. He had been, over the course of roughly 18 months, shifting his financial life into structures that did not include me. The subsidiary account under the Ashvale Group entity, I found a reference to it in a stack of tax documents he had brought home to review and left on the kitchen table overnight. He had moved a significant portion of his ongoing consulting revenue into it. Not hidden, not illegal, but structured in a way that would not appear in the standard asset disclosure he'd have to make in divorce proceedings unless someone knew to ask for it. Sans a personal investment position that had been liquid for 2 years. He had mentioned it to me once as a speculative thing that hadn't worked out, and I had accepted that and moved on. I found the corresponding account statement in the same tax document stack. The investment had not failed. It was valued at around $65,000 and had been liquid for 22 months. He had been planning this departure for longer than the hotel stays implied. That realization was the one that changed the temperature of everything. The affair I could understand as weakness, as the ordinary failure of a person who wants more than they have and lacks the courage to say so directly. The financial repositioning was not weakness. It was deliberate work. It meant he had decided, and while he was deciding, he had sat across from me at the kitchen table on Thursday evenings and eaten the food I made and maintained the surface of a marriage he had already, in every way that mattered, ended. I went to the study that evening and sat in the dark for a long time. Then I called Josephine. Josephine Vander had been my mother's attorney before I inherited her. She was in her early 60s, worked from a converted terrace office in the older part of the city, and had the specific quality of a very good structural engineer. She looked at situations and located the points under stress. She answered her own phone at all hours. She had a yellow legal pad she used for everything, and when she looked at you from across her desk, you felt that she was not so much listening to you as filing what you said. And I called her on a Wednesday evening and said I needed to understand something about property law. She said, "When can you come in?" Her office smelled like old coffee and printed documents. The desk had papers on it in what looked like disorder, but which, I had learned, was a system she could navigate flawlessly. She listened to my situation without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one question. "Has he said anything directly about the property yet?" "Not yet," I told her, but the direction was clear. She nodded slowly. She wrote something on the yellow pad. Then she said, "Then we have time. And in property law, time is almost everything." What she explained to me over the next 2 hours became the architecture of everything that followed. A lien, she told me, is an encumbrance attached to a property. It travels with the land, not the person. When a property is transferred from one owner to another, any existing liens are transferred along with it. The new owner takes the property subject to those encumbrances. They cannot sell or refinance with a clean title until every lien is satisfied in full. A title search conducted by any competent conveyancing solicitor will reveal all recorded liens without exception. This is basic property law. It is the kind of thing every person who has ever bought a house has technically been told, but which most people don't internalize. Because in the ordinary course of a property transaction, liens are things you clear before transfer, not things you inherit after it. Josephine asked me what the current equity situation was. I walked her through the numbers. The house had appraised 18 months earlier for $380,000, and the Wyndham District rezoning and the new transit infrastructure announced since then had pushed the actual market value higher. I had been tracking comparable sales, and the best current estimate was $420,000 to $440,000, against an outstanding mortgage balance of just under $80,000. Equity, approximately $350,000. Most of it mine by financial contribution, though the joint title meant it was legally co-owned. She said, "Tell me about your credit history." Impeccable. I had never missed a payment on anything. My credit score was in the highest bracket. She said, "Then you have a path. Several, in fact. Let me walk you through them." The first mechanism she described was a home equity line of credit. A HELOC is a revolving credit product secured against the equity in a property as a co-owner with a clean credit history and a mortgage in good standing. And importantly, as the primary payment contact on the mortgage account, I was eligible to apply for one without requiring Dorian's participation, provided the application was processed through the right channel. The HELOC, once approved, would be registered as a recorded lien against the property. The registration would appear in any subsequent title search. If I drew down the credit line before the property was transferred, the debt would be mine. But the lien would follow the land. If the property was then transferred to a new owner, and that new owner would inherit both the title and the obligation to account for the lien. They could not sell or refinance to clear title without first satisfying the HELOC balance. The lender would be repaid, but the funds I had drawn would already be in my possession. I asked her to walk me through the numbers again, slowly. If the property was worth $420,000 and the outstanding mortgage was $80,000, the available equity was $340,000. HELOC products in our jurisdiction typically offered up to 80% of appraised value minus outstanding mortgage, which put the maximum line at approximately $256,000. She said I could apply for up to that amount. She recommended applying for slightly under the maximum to reduce scrutiny. $238,000. She said, "That number is defensible." I kept my face still. I said, "How long to process?" She said, "If your application is clean, 10 to 14 business days." The second mechanism, the mechanic's lien. She had a contractor she worked with, a licensed general contractor named Ferris, who was experienced with legally complex property situations. What she proposed was genuine. Ferris would assess the property and produce a documented renovation scope. Legitimate work, Real scope, real quote. If a notice of contract was filed with the county before the renovation commenced, and the property subsequently transferred before the work was completed and paid for, Ferris would have full legal standing to file a mechanic's lien for the value of his contracted services. Under our jurisdiction's construction lien statute, a mechanic's lien attaches to the property regardless of who currently owns it. It is a lien on the land, not on the person who hired the contractor. I asked her what scope would produce a reasonable and defensible lien value. She outlined foundation waterproofing, exterior brickwork repointing, subfloor section replacement in the east wing, and a full electrical assessment. The east wing subfloor had always had 2 soft spots. This was not invented, it was accurate, and I had been meaning to address it for years. The quote Ferris produced would not be fabricated. It would be real. He came to the house on a Thursday while Dorian was at work, and I walked him through the rooms, and he took measurements and notes with a quietness I appreciated. He quoted $64,200. His preliminary notice was filed with the county clerk's office the following Monday. I had 2 encumbrances in progress before Dorian said a direct word to me about the house. The HELOC application took 11 days to process. I had submitted it online on the evening I returned from Josephine's office, and I spent the intervening days behaving exactly as I normally behaved, working from the study, attending a site review with a firm in the Aldercroft district, cooking dinner, listening to Dorian talk about Asheville group matters in the abstracted way he spoke about work when he was protecting information. Nothing about my behavior changed. I did not look at him differently, or leave the kitchen faster than usual after dinner, or let my voice carry anything it hadn't always carried. So I had learned in 11 years to be very still when it mattered. The HELOC approval arrived by email on a Tuesday morning. I opened it at my drafting table with a cup of tea going cold beside me. Credit line approved, $238,000 secured against the property, registered against the title effective the same business day. I forwarded it to Josephine. 20 minutes later, she confirmed that the lien had been recorded in the county property records. Gideon, her property associate, had verified the recording number that morning. I saved the confirmation to a folder I had labeled Professional Development 2020 in my email client. Then I opened the specification set I was working on and went back to work. Josephine and I had discussed timing carefully. The plan was not to draw down the HELOC immediately. Drawing it before Dorian's demands escalated would look, in retrospect, like premeditation, which it was, but the legal position was stronger if the draw happened closer to the point of conflict. What mattered legally was that the lien was registered. The draw was a separate and subsequent instrument. I needed to wait for Dorian to commit himself. He began the oblique approach in the first week of May. Dorian had always been skilled at oblique approaches. He had described his professional negotiation style to me once as letting the other party discover your argument before you make it. And at the time, I had found it strategically impressive. I understood it differently now that it was being used in my kitchen. He began by talking about the house as though it were a burden. The upkeep, the garden becoming more labor than pleasure, and how the district was changing, which was true, but which he had never framed negatively before. He raised this twice in casual contexts, the way you raise something you want to normalize before you make it explicit. He mentioned, over dinner on a Thursday, that a colleague had sold a comparably sized property in the Wyndham area and had come out significantly ahead. He mentioned, without looking at me directly, that some couples, when a marriage reached a natural endpoint, his exact words, found it administratively simpler to deal with shared assets outside the formal divorce process. I said, "That makes sense for some people." He nodded as if I had agreed to something. I had not agreed to anything. By the 3rd week of May, the oblique approach had run its course, and Dorian came to the direct conversation. He had poured himself a glass of wine, which he rarely did on a weeknight, and he had set his phone face down on the kitchen table, and he had that particular quality of stillness that comes from having rehearsed what you're about to say enough times that you've stopped being afraid of it. He told me he had been unhappy for a long time. He said he didn't say this to cause pain, but because honesty was important to him. He said there was someone else. Here he paused, and that he had been trying to find the right path forward. He said the word fair 4 times in the first 6 minutes. Then he said, The cleanest path for the house would be to transfer your share directly to a third party rather than go through a contested property division. I said, "What third party?" He said, "Seraphine." "Oh, she has the financial standing to assume the property. You'd receive a buyout payment from me directly. I've had an accountant look at it, and the figure is reasonable." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "You want me to sign my house over to the woman you've been staying in hotels with for the past 8 months?" He didn't flinch. I noticed this. He had known the question was coming and had prepared for it. He said, "I understand how that sounds, but a formal divorce proceeding and the associated property dispute could take 2 to 3 years and cost both of us significantly. This is cleaner." I asked what the buyout figure was. He named a number. Approximately 40% of the property's current market value, which was, depending on how generously you read it, either a low opening offer or an insult with arithmetic attached. And I suspected he had chosen it as a starting position, expecting negotiation, which was an interesting miscalculation. I said, "I need time to think." He said he understood. He appreciated my reasonableness. He was visibly relieved by the absence of an emotional reaction, which was itself a kind of useful information. I went to bed before him that night. I lay in the dark with the familiar sounds of the house around me. The radiator in the hall, the particular creak the second stair made, the way the wind at this time of year moved through the east-facing window from the garden. And I thought, he still doesn't know what he doesn't know. The week that followed required the most precise execution of everything I had been preparing. I called Josephine the next morning and told her the direct conversation had happened. So she said she was ready and walked me through the next steps. I needed to open the account at Fenwick Community Credit Union before drawing down the HELOC. The account needed to have no connection to Dorian's banking ecosystem, no shared institutions, no cross-linked products. I had researched this carefully. Dorian's accounts were across 2 major national banks. I had previously held accounts at both, which had to be closed and replaced entirely. Fenwick was a credit union based in the Caldwell district, established for over 40 years, entirely local. I chose it because a credit union is not a bank. It is a member cooperative, and its records are not part of the same shared reporting infrastructure as the national banks. I also chose it because it was 2 train stops from the office of a commercial property firm that had recently inquired about expanding their contract work with me, which meant my presence in that part of the city would read, if anyone thought to track it, as professional. The branch manager, Patricia, was in her late 40s and processed my account opening with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times. I brought cash for the opening deposit, $6,000, a number I had chosen because it was below the individual reporting threshold and looked like standard savings behavior. She did not ask me why I was opening a new personal account. People open accounts for many reasons. I had the account active within 45 minutes. Back at the house, else I spent 2 evenings in the south-facing study working through the HELOC draw mechanics with Josephine's guidance. Drawing down a HELOC is not a single transaction. It is a revolving credit product, meaning funds are accessed as needed from the approved line. I planned to draw the full balance, but I needed to do so in a way that was both legally clean and practically difficult to reverse quickly. Josephine advised spreading the draw across 4 business days, in transfers below the individual reporting threshold, moving funds to multiple sub-accounts I had set up within the Fenwick account structure. This was not evasion. Every transfer would be traceable and entirely legitimate. It was structuring in the protective sense, not the criminal one. The sub-accounts took a week to establish. 3 general savings accounts and 1 locked term deposit account, which would prevent access for 90 days, but also prevent any incoming legal instrument from reaching the funds during that window. Josephine had reviewed and approved this structure in detail. While I was setting this up, Dorian pressed twice more. The first approach was gentle. He said he had been thinking about the timeline and wanted to make sure I had what I needed to feel comfortable with the arrangement. He asked if the buyout figure needed further discussion. I said I was still thinking. The second approach had more edge. He mentioned, carefully, that protracted divorce proceedings could result in significant legal costs for both parties, and that a settlement structured outside the formal process was likely to preserve more value for everyone involved. He mentioned this in the way people mention things they intend as warnings, while maintaining complete deniability about the nature of the warning. I said, "You might be right about that. Let me talk to my lawyer." He blinked once, almost imperceptible. "You've engaged someone?" "I'm getting advice," I said. "That's reasonable, isn't it?" He said of course it was. He was very still while he said it. I called Josephine from the study that night and told her he now knew I had legal counsel. She said that was actually useful. "It creates a record that you were acting with professional guidance throughout," she said. "That matters for the equitable distribution proceedings." On the Thursday of the following week, I drew down the HELOC. I did it in 4 transactions across the course of the day, totaled between 7 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. $238,000 moved in 4 roughly equal tranches from the credit line into the Fenwick subaccounts. Each transaction was documented by the digital record the credit union generated automatically. Each was within the regulatory threshold for a single transaction. By 4 in the afternoon, the credit line was drawn to 0, and the Fenwick accounts held the balance. I closed my computer, went to the garden, and spent an hour turning the soil in the raised beds. The lavender was starting to come up again. Dorian's solicitor sent the transfer documents the following Monday, as Dorian had promised. I took them directly to Josephine, who read them with the same yellow legal pad focus she applied to everything. She made 2 objections to existing clauses and had them removed. She added 1 clause, boilerplate on its surface, inserted in plain sight, confirming that the transfer was made with full disclosure of all encumbrances affecting the property. This language is often included in property transfers as a standard representation. Dorian's solicitor did not flag it as unusual or consequential. They were confirming on paper that all encumbrances had been disclosed. What they were not doing, because they did not know what to look for, was conducting a current title search before signing. That oversight was theirs, and it would be theirs to live with. I signed the deed on a Tuesday morning in late June. The signing took place at a shared workspace in the commercial district, one of those neutral locations that has the quality of an airport, designed for transactions that don't want a home. Dorian's solicitor had arranged it. Dorian was there. Seraphine was there. I had not expected her. I processed this without showing it, the way I had been processing things without showing them for several months. She was younger than I had pictured, though I hadn't pictured her precisely. I had a name, a professional context, a voice adjustment in Dorian's tone, and a hotel loyalty point statement. She was in her early 30s, dressed in a dark blazer with the air of someone who treats their professional wardrobe as a form of armor. She had good posture and the kind of self-contained composure that comes from long practice at being watched and learning how to receive that watching without yielding to it. Dorian introduced us with the specific discomfort of a man who knows the introduction is absurd and has decided not to acknowledge that. He said her name. She said mine. We looked at each other in the way 2 women look at each other when they have been placed in a situation neither of them designed, and both of them understand completely. I said, "Nice to meet you." She said, "Likewise." Her voice was careful. I sat down at the table and read the documents. All of them. The notary shifted in his chair because people rarely read documents at signing meetings. They scan, they sign, they leave. I read every clause, line by line, with the slow deliberateness of someone who has spent 11 years reading structural specifications and understands that what a document says and what it is understood to mean are sometimes different things. And the document is the one that lasts. I needed the record to show that I had reviewed and understood the terms, that I had been advised, that I had not acted under duress or in ignorance. Then I signed. Dorian exhaled. It was almost inaudible, but I was seated 3 feet from him and I heard it, the sound of a plan completing. He reached across the table and shook the notary's hand as if they had shared an achievement. Seraphine received the deed with both hands, which was an unusual gesture for a document exchange, but which I noted as sincere. She was taking this seriously. She believed in what she was receiving. I picked up my bag and walked to the door. At the threshold, I paused, just the fraction of a second it takes to take a mental photograph. The notary with his stamp, Dorian's solicitor with his briefcase, Dorian with his exhale, Seraphine with the deed in both hands. The room was ordinary. The moment was complete. I walked out into the street, and the air smelled like early summer and bus exhaust, and I stood on the pavement for exactly as long as it took me to decide which direction to walk. I moved out of the house the following week. The move had been prepared over 3 months, which meant the actual execution was quiet and efficient. The large furniture I left, it was mostly Dorian's preference, and I hadn't loved the sofa since the second year. I took the drafting table in sections, carefully labeled and wrapped. I took my books and my architectural files and the kitchen equipment I had accumulated over 11 years of cooking with intention for a person who rarely noticed what he was eating. Then I had taken a flat in the Caldwell district, a neighborhood I had always liked for its older buildings and its proximity to 2 firms I intended to approach about contract work expansion. The flat was on the 2nd floor of a building that had been converted from a former printing warehouse, and it had the particular quality of a space that knew what it was made of. High ceilings, original windows, no pretension. It smelled on the first morning like old stone and city dust and the particular chemical ghost of 40 years of printing ink. And underneath all of that, like clean surfaces and open air. My window faced east. I had morning light I had been missing for years without naming the absence. The first night I slept there, I slept 8 hours without once coming to the surface. The following 3 months were not recovery months. I want to be clear about this because the word recovery implies that I had been damaged and needed to be restored to a previous state. I had not been damaged, I had been educated. What those months were was construction. I retained Josephine formally for the equitable distribution proceedings, which I had decided to pursue regardless of the transfer, because the buyout figure Dorian had paid was substantially below my documented financial contribution to the property, and the court had instruments to correct that imbalance. I also retained Gideon Harlow at a commercial property practice, because I anticipated that when the lien situation became visible, I would need counsel who specifically understood commercial property law. Josephine and I had discussed the timing of Seraphine's discovery carefully. The most probable path to discovery was a title search conducted by a buyer's conveyancing solicitor. Seraphine was commercially sharp. She would list the property. A buyer would make an offer. The buyer's solicitor would pull the title search. The encumbrances would appear. We had anticipated a delay between the transfer and the listing. People who receive property in the context of a complex personal arrangement sometimes take time before activating it. We had assumed 3 to 6 months. Seraphine listed the property in the 2nd week of August, 6 weeks after the deed transfer. Josephine called me on a Tuesday morning. I had been at my drafting table working on a residential specification for a firm in Windmore, a building with a problematic east wall and a client who kept adding windows to sections that needed to stay solid. I set my pencil down. "She's listed it?" Josephine said. "What price?" I asked. $460,000, the upper end of the Wyndham market, a number that accurately reflected the double lot and the rezoning upside. Seraphine had done her research. She understood what she thought she had. "Standard timeline to title search," I said. Josephine said, 5 to 7 business days after an accepted offer. "Let me know." I picked up the pencil and went back to the east wall problem. There is a quality to anticipation when you have removed the uncertainty from it. It's not suspense. It's closer to focus. The same focused attention I had when calculating load requirements. Knowing what the structure needed to support, running the numbers, waiting for the confirmation that the numbers had held. And the first offer came in 12 days later. The buyer's solicitor pulled the title search on day 6. The result? 2 recorded encumbrances. A home equity line of credit in the amount of $238,000, registered against the property title approximately 6 weeks before the deed transfer to the current owner, currently drawn in full. A mechanic's lien notice in the amount of $64,200, filed by a licensed contractor for contracted renovation services on the property with a commencement date that had not been met. Total encumbrances: $302,000 against a property listed at $460,000. The buyer's solicitor ran the calculation. Against a purchase price of $410,000, a modest reduction from list, which was standard, the encumbrance burden left a net recoverable equity of approximately $108,000. But clearing the encumbrances was not optional. Any title transfer required clean title. The HELOC and the mechanic's lien had to be satisfied in full before the sale could close. At the negotiated purchase price, that arithmetic did not close. The buyer withdrew. Their solicitor sent a letter to Seraphine's agent. The property was encumbered. The encumbrances significantly exceeded expectations. The buyer would not proceed without a price reduction that made satisfaction of the liens economically viable. Seraphine's agent sent back a request for clarification. The solicitor replied with the registration numbers of both encumbrances and the amounts. I received this information from Josephine 3 days later. I relayed through her county records contact. I was eating dinner at my kitchen table. Pasta, simple, the kind I make when I want to eat without thinking about cooking. I put my fork down while she spoke. When she finished, I said, "What do you think she does next?" Josephine said, "Tries to find a buyer who can absorb the encumbrances, or tries to challenge the lien." I said, "Can she challenge the HELOC?" Josephine said, "Only if she can demonstrate fraud or bad faith in the original application. Your application was legitimate. Your credit was clean. The mortgage was current. You were a co-owner with full legal standing to apply, and there was no misrepresentation to the lender." "And the transfer documents," I said, "included the full disclosure clause?" She said, "Their solicitor drafted it on our instruction without understanding why we wanted it. That clause confirms they represented the transfer as made with full knowledge of all encumbrances. Whether or not they knew the encumbrances existed, they signed a document saying they had disclosed them." I picked up my fork. "Thank you, Josephine," she said. "There's more to come." The second offer came in September. A developer. I had expected this. The Wyndham District rezoning made the double lot attractive to residential developers who wanted to build new and had no attachment to the existing structure. A developer would factor the encumbrances into their offer calculation and come back with a number that reflected the realistic net position. The developer came back with an offer of $215,000 against the $460,000 list price, against the $420,000 appraised value, against the $302,000 in total encumbrances that had to be cleared before any title could transfer clean. At $215,000, the proceeds after clearing the existing mortgage balance of $80,000 left $135,000 of net funds, against $302,000 in liens. The math didn't close. There was no version of that sale at that price that allowed Seraphine to walk away with anything other than a cleared obligation and a negative balance. The second offer was rejected, not because Seraphine wanted to reject it, because there was no world in which accepting it made sense. I heard, through Josephine's contacts, that Dorian had become directly involved at this point. He had hired a different solicitor, not the one who had handled the transfer, a different firm, one with more property litigation experience, and asked for a review of the HELOC's legal standing. The solicitor's assessment, as Josephine relayed it, had taken 10 days to produce and was definitive. The HELOC was a valid, registered lien. It had been applied for and processed while I was a co-owner with full legal standing. The mortgage account was in good standing at the time of application. There had been no misrepresentation. A challenge on fraud grounds was theoretically available, but would require demonstrating that I had applied with intent to defraud, that the funds had been used illegally, or that the registration had involved procedural error. None of those grounds existed. Only the solicitor's advice. A fraud challenge could be filed, but the probability of success was low. The timeline was 18 to 24 months, and the legal costs would likely exceed any possible recovery. Dorian did not file the challenge. What he did instead was what I had always known he would eventually do, which was to attempt to make the situation someone else's fault, in a way that allowed him to maintain the posture of a person who had behaved reasonably throughout. He called me on a Thursday afternoon in October. I was at the east window with a specification set, the same posture I had held in the Wyndham study for 11 years, but different now. East-facing light, the street below the former printing warehouse, the smell of old stone when I opened the glass, my name on a plate outside a building 2 streets over. Well, when his name appeared on my phone, I looked at it for one full ring. Not to decide whether to answer. I had known this call was coming and had decided how to handle it months earlier, just to note the feeling of the moment. There was something in it I wanted to accurately record. I answered. He said, "Mira." His voice was different from any version of it I had heard in 11 years of knowing him. Not angry. Anger would have been straightforward. This was the voice of a man who has been working very hard to maintain composure while simultaneously composing a legal argument, and who has not entirely succeeded at either task. He said he needed to understand what had happened with the property's financial situation. I said, "Which part?" He said he had been made aware of an encumbrance on the title. He said he wasn't certain when it had been applied for. He wondered if there had been a paperwork issue. I said, "There wasn't a paperwork issue." Silence. He said, "The HELOC was registered before the transfer." I said, "The transfer documentation which your solicitor prepared included a clause confirming the transfer was made with full disclosure of all encumbrances. Your side signed that document." He said, "The transfer was made in good faith." I said, "I know. We had an agreement. We had a signed deed," I said, "with specific language about encumbrances. Your solicitor's language, not mine." There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing, the specific quality of his breathing in a moment of sustained effort, the same quality it had in the early years when he was working late on a difficult proposal. I hunched over the kitchen table, and I would bring him coffee without being asked. I used to think that quality meant intensity. I understood it now as the sound of a person who had always believed the variables would arrange themselves in his favor, encountering evidence to the contrary. He said, "What do you want from this?" Not a question. A statement phrased as a question because he was recording the call on his end and wanted my response on record. I was recording it on my end. I had been recording since I answered. I said, "I want you to be aware that I'm recording this conversation. If anything in this call constitutes an acknowledgement of wrongdoing or misrepresentation in the transfer process, it will be included in my equitable distribution filing." He was very still on the other end of the line. Then he said, "I'll have my solicitor contact Josephine." I said, "That's the right call." He hung up. I set my phone face down on the desk and looked at the specifications set in front of me. A residential renovation in the Aldercroft district, south-facing extension, load calculations for a new opening in a bearing wall, the work that I had always been good at, the work I had done from a south-facing study for 11 years, while a man I had fed and housed and believed in had been positioning himself to take the house out from under me. I picked up my pencil. The equitable distribution proceedings moved through the courts over the following 4 months and concluded in January. The record I had built was thorough. Bank transfer documentation showing my full down payment 11 years prior. Payment records showing my primary and majority servicing of the mortgage in the first 3 years of the marriage. Tax records showing consistent income and financial contribution throughout. And Josephine's documented account of my consultations, which established that I had been seeking legal advice from the moment I identified financial irregularity, not in reaction to Dorian's moves, but in parallel with them. The transfer buyout figure Dorian had paid was examined by the court as a prior settlement instrument. Given my documented contribution, the court found that the buyout substantially undervalued my share. Dorian was ordered to pay a supplementary settlement figure that effectively tripled what he had originally offered at the kitchen table. The HELOC was not part of the equitable distribution calculation. It was a personal debt I had taken against equity I had built, and the funds I had been drawn legitimately before the transfer. The court had no instrument to recover funds drawn on a registered credit product by a co-owner with full legal standing. The debt existed against the property, not against me personally. When the property eventually resolved, so would the debt. Through the autumn and into winter, Seraphine made 2 more attempts to sell. Both failed for the same reason. The encumbrance burden on the property meant that no buyer could acquire clean title without the HELOC and mechanics lien being satisfied first, and the only sale price at which that satisfaction was arithmetically achievable left the seller with nothing or less. She had been handed a house that looked, from the outside, like an asset. But from the inside of a title report, it was an obligation. She had stopped making payments on the property's financial obligations by November. There was, as it turned out, a secondary detail that Dorian's solicitor had also failed to address when drafting the original transfer. The mortgage had remained in both Dorian's name and mine. The deed transfer had conveyed ownership interest to Seraphine, but the original mortgage note was a separate legal instrument binding on the original borrowers, and no assumption agreement had been executed. This was not an accident. Josephine had been very careful not to raise it. When payments on the property stopped, the mortgage servicer initiated default proceedings. I received a notification letter in November. As a named party on the original mortgage, Standard procedure required notification of any default event affecting the account. I had been waiting for exactly this. Josephine had prepared a release instrument in advance, a document that would remove me from the mortgage obligation entirely, contingent on receipt of the court-ordered supplementary settlement payment from the equitable distribution proceedings. When Dorian paid, and he paid, because the alternative was contempt of court proceedings that would have been considerably more damaging than the payment itself, Josephine filed the release instrument. It was processed and recorded in March. I was removed from the mortgage obligation at the same time the property entered formal foreclosure proceedings. The foreclosure moved on standard statutory timeline. Notices, cure periods, formal filing, the extended waiting period required by law, and then the auction. Gideon attended on my behalf and called me from outside the auction room. His voice had the particular acoustics of a building hallway. Slightly hollow, slightly echoing, the sound of institutional spaces. Sale price, $289,000. After the outstanding mortgage balance and foreclosure processing costs were cleared, the remaining proceeds were distributed to lien holders in order of registration priority. The HELOC was the senior lien. Its registration date predated all other encumbrances. $238,000 went to the credit line. The lender was repaid in full. The mechanic's lien received a partial payment from the remaining proceeds, approximately $31,000 against the $64,000 claimed. Ferris had contracted with me, knowing this outcome was possible. His agreement with Josephine had included provisions for exactly this scenario. He did not consider himself a loser in the arrangement, and he was not one. Seraphine received nothing from the foreclosure sale. She had held the deed to the Wyndham property for approximately 17 months. She had paid transfer taxes on it. She had paid for listing fees, 2 rounds of conveyancing solicitor fees, the property management costs during the months it sat vacant and unsaleable, and the professional time of the solicitor who had spent 6 weeks trying to find a legal challenge to the HELOC and failed. Yet she had held a deed to a house for 17 months and walked away with exactly what the house had contained when she first took it into her hands: a set of obligations she hadn't fully understood, and a gap between what she thought she was getting and what the title records actually said. Dorian's outcome took longer to play out, and I had less information about it than I had about the property proceedings. What Gideon had learned through his contacts in the county financial records infrastructure was that Dorian had been required to participate in the foreclosure proceedings as a named party on the original mortgage. His negotiation with the mortgage servicer to avoid a full deficiency judgment had been successful. But the terms required liquidating the Asheville Group subsidiary account, the one he had been building since the first year of our marriage, the one he had structured carefully outside our shared financial picture, the account I had found referenced in the tax documents he had left on the kitchen table, the account he had been using to prepare for a future he had intended to inhabit without me. It was gone. I said, when Gideon told me, "That's interesting." He said, "I thought you'd want to know." I said, "I did want to know." I paused. Thank you, Gideon. I did not follow Dorian's career trajectory after that. I had heard, through the ordinary diffusion of information that happens in a professional community of overlapping networks, that his position at the Asheville Group had ended approximately 6 months after the property crisis became a known matter in their shared professional circles. I don't know the precise circumstances. I didn't need to know them. I had not set out to end his career. I had set out to ensure he could not strip mine. Those are different projects, and they produce different kinds of satisfaction. The capital I had extracted from the HELOC, $238,000, less the amount extinguished against the foreclosure proceeds when the credit line was repaid by the senior lien distribution, combined with the court settlement and the supplementary distribution order, represented a net recovery that substantially exceeded what Dorian had offered me at the kitchen table on the night he poured himself a glass of wine and told me he believed in honesty. Numbers, not justice. I want to be clear about that. No number corrects for 11 years of a thing that looked like a marriage from the outside while being, structurally, something else entirely. But numbers were what I had to work with, and I worked with them precisely the same way I had always worked with load calculations and structural specifications and the weight-bearing requirements of things people intended to last. By the following spring, I had used the capital to acquire a 2/3 equity stake in a small architectural practice in the Caldwell district. 2 streets from my flat, to occupying the ground floor of a building that had once been a letterpress. The practice had 3 licensed architects, a project coordinator named Dana, who had been with the firm since its founding, and a principal who had built something real over 20 years and wanted to retire into it rather than sell it to someone who wouldn't understand what had been made. The acquisition negotiation I handled myself. My name went on the door in April. Not front and center, it was a small firm, and I had no interest in displacing what had been built. It went on the door the way names go on doors when the intention is permanence rather than announcement. A small plate beside the entrance, black text on brushed steel, flush with the wall. I still work from a south-facing window when I can arrange it. The building has 4. Now I have the one on the 2nd floor, the one that overlooks the garden the previous tenants had planted along the east wall. Mostly herbs, some lavender that came back without being tended. The way lavender does when it has found the right soil and doesn't need anything more from you than to be left alone to do what it was built to do. I don't press my palm to the doorframe when I leave. I don't need to check if it's still there.